Welcome everyone to the Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series hosted by the Indiana Environmental Resilience Institute. We would like to acknowledge and to honor the Mi'kmaq, Lenape, Badwa, Wadamik, and Sewanee people as past, present, and future caretakers of the lands on which Indiana University Bloomington is located. These ancestral indigenous homelands and resources are the current home of the Environmental Resilience Institute. We encourage everyone to engage with contemporary communities, to learn the histories of this land, to look at who has and does not have access to its resources, and to examine your own place, abilities, and obligations within this process of reparative work. Our webinar today will focus on community solar projects that allow communities, businesses, and governments equal access to the economic and environmental benefits of solar generation. All webinar attendees are muted. Please enter your questions into the chat function, which you can access by hovering your mouse over the Zoom window. In the last few minutes of the webinar, we will share a feedback survey through a Zoom poll. We are recording today's webinar. I'll share the link to that recording along with follow-up resources with all the registrants early next week so that you can share what you have learned with your colleagues. And now I am very pleased to introduce today's moderator, Sarah Mincy, the Managing Director of IU's Environmental Resilience Institute.
Thank you, Beverly, and welcome everyone. Community solar projects are important because they not only diversify the energy grid and enhance resilience, but can be used to ensure a just energy transition for workers, businesses, and communities. Today, we are really excited to have McReynolds from the city of Indianapolis discuss the Indianapolis Solar Pilot Program, which is a community solar project focused on energy equity. We are also excited to have Trevor Memmott, a PhD student at Indiana University, who will discuss what a just energy transition is, as well as some of his research focused on energy equity. The webinar series is coordinated by Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. In addition to our webinar series, ERI has many other resources available to local governments and the general public that I want to make you aware of. One resource that I want to make sure you know about is the In This Climate podcast presented by ERI and the IU Media School. So every week, the Environmental News podcast outlines a sustainable and resilient path forward through rigorous analysis of scientific data, conversation, and storytelling. Additionally, In This Climate amplifies the voices most affected by environmental burdens and climate change, and those historically marginalized within the environmental movement. We hope you will also join us for next month's webinar, which will focus on green infrastructure and stormwater management. We hope you'll encourage your friends and colleagues to join if they work in that area. Another resource I want to mention is the Sustainable Development Code website, which has numerous resources for local governments working on environmental issues. Organized by category, the website contains good, better, and best practice suggestions for removing code barriers, creating incentives, and filling regulatory gaps. Chapter 7.2 of the Sustainable Development Code specifically addresses solar energy and includes case studies of how local governments have implemented it within their communities. We want to thank AIM, AIC, Health by Design, and the Indiana Public Health Association for continuing to support this webinar series. And thank you to everyone who is attending today's webinar. We hope that you'll encourage your friends and your colleagues to watch a recording of this webinar if they're unable to attend today. So without further ado, please let me give you a little bio for our wonderful speakers today. Trevor Memmott is a PhD student at Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. He studies environmental policy with an interest in environmental justice and energy transition. He got his BS in political science and an MPA from the University of Idaho. And before moving to Bloomington, he worked as an administrative assistant at the city of Moscow and as an adjunct professor at Washington State University and the University of Idaho. Mo McReynolds is the Community Engagement Manager for the Office of Sustainability. Her role includes stakeholder relationship building and project management as a part of Thrive Indianapolis, the city's first sustainability and resilience plan. Prior to that, she served in the mayor's office as a mayor's neighborhood advocate. Mo serves on the boards of Groundwork Indy, Reconnecting to Our Waterways, Greater Allisonville Community Council, and St. Pius Young Adult Commission. So I'd like to turn it over to Trevor now to offer his presentation.
All right, hello everyone. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. So I'm going to talk about the part of the energy transition that I study, which is energy and security. Obviously, the energy transition is a wide topic, and there's a lot of things to discuss when it comes to the very intricacies of a transitioning economy when it comes to the environment and energy. But my focus is on energy and security. So just to give some background, I started studying energy and security essentially right when the COVID pandemic hit. We had been interested in this topic. We had been sort of formulating a plan for how to study it. And as soon as the pandemic hit, we decided that that would be a great opportunity to sort of get in the field and start surveying people to understand what they're going through when it comes to the pandemic, but of course, then to make broader generalizations about what is happening in the energy insecurity space. So that's kind of my field of expertise and what I'm going to talk about today when it comes to transitioning our economy and what that means for low-income households who have to deal with some of the burdens that come from energy consumption. So there are a lot of different definitions in the literature for energy insecurity. We've developed our own, which is very simple, which is just an inability to meet one's household energy demands. First and foremost, this typically starts with the inability or the struggle to pay one's energy bill. So it might mean things like paying your bill late. It might mean things like paying your bill once every 2 months. It might mean things like, of course, just not being able to pay your bill at all. And of course, there are big consequences when that's the case. So we define these economic, behavioral, and physical components as the consequences that fall out from energy insecurity. So a pretty common example is that a household can't pay its energy bill, but is worried about getting their energy shut off. And so they go and get a payday loan, right? And we all know that the sort of predatoriness of payday loan industry and how that can impact people's long-term economic future. What we've also found is that there are also what we call coping strategies when it comes to energy insecurity, which people engage in order to say keep their house cool enough or warm enough during weather events when the temperature gets too hot or too cold. And of course, low-income households are constantly trying to keep their costs down, so they will engage in coping strategies to avoid the worst forms of energy insecurity, to avoid being shut off or to avoid not being able to pay their bill. And so in addition to this sort of economic burden that gets placed on these households, we have people doing things like burning trash to stay warm, like using their dryer to stay warm. These really these really dangerous behaviors that people have to turn to. One thing, as a bit of an aside, is that one thing that I found out through our research is that space heaters are extremely common, and they're also very dangerous. So space heaters are actually the leading cause of residential fires, and they are very commonly used by low-income households that don't have access to central air or can't afford their bill. It's considered a cheaper option, but it can really be quite dangerous. So there are all kinds of strategies that people engage in just to maintain a basic standard of keeping a comfortable temperature in their home. And we also have this intersection with health insecurity. So one thing that we've found is that energy insecurity is highly correlated with deficient housing conditions. So that can be somebody has a hole in the wall, somebody has poor insulation, somebody has mold in the house. And so that can lead to real serious health effects. And then when we see this headline about this New Jersey woman, and unfortunately, this is not like a one-off thing that happened one time. This is an occurrence that's happening around the country. And this is obviously worst case scenario, but we see degrees of this thing happening quite often. And one of the big things that some of my colleagues have studied is the sort of bureaucratic burden that comes around this space, where there's this concept around the literature. I don't know if any of you heard about it, but it's like the time tax, where there's this, people will have to fill out a welfare form, and it will take them basically 50, 60 hours to find all the documents and fill out this form. And we see the same thing when it comes to energy. When people try to get help for their, help to pay their bill, or help to not get shut off, or in this case, help to from their utility, where if you go in and read the story, this New Jersey woman's family was calling the utility company dozens of times in the days following up, but because of the bureaucratic process, they weren't able to actually reach them. So these are some of the most severe consequences that we see from energy insecurity. And then we have this conceptual framework of a just energy transition. And this first bullet point is the direct relation to energy insecurity. We're talking about shifting the cost burden away from low-income households. Right now, low-income households face higher energy burdens, which we define as the percentage of your income that you spend on energy costs. And one of the things that's really important about this is that low-income people typically sort of consume on the margin, right? So they're only taking as many showers, they're only using as much heat as they absolutely need to stay comfortable, whereas middle and upper income households are often, you might take 2 or 3 showers a day because that you like to be clean, and you don't have to worry about the cost of doing so. The point being, when low-income people have to adjust their energy consumption, it's very, very difficult. They're kind of already at the floor of what they need just to survive. So they can't sort of drastically cut their energy consumption. So we see a big cost burden being on low-income individuals. It's a huge problem throughout the country. We also have investments in education and economic redevelopment in coal communities. When I say coal communities, there are lots of, this is just kind of a stand-in, kind of our most popular stand-in, but any community that, is fossil fuel intensive, it's very important that we make sure that we invest in these communities and allow them to sort of build the economy anew as we're transitioning away from these fossil fuel intensive industries, right? And we've seen a very clear case study of where this didn't happen, where we saw many places in the Midwest sort of get hollowed out as manufacturing left, and we just didn't have a plan in place. So that you have places like Detroit who just go from being, one of the wealthiest and strongest economies in the country to one of the poorest basically overnight, right? And it's because we didn't make these investments. We weren't planning for this. And of course, the climate transition brings up the exact same problem. It's the exact same issue, that we're trying to transition away from these fuels, and we need to make sure that our communities are built to do that. Which brings me to the third point, which is resilience and adaptation, right? A lot of times we talk about stopping or reversing the climate crisis, but a big part of what we're doing now when it comes to public policy is trying to help mitigate the climate crisis. We already know that effects from climate change are going to happen. And so we have to ensure that our communities are built to sustain them, right? So that when, say, a flood comes through, it's obviously going to be a bad event, no matter what. It's going to be, dangerous to people and all that. But we at least want to make it so that these events aren't sort of, destroying entire communities. They aren't, infrastructure isn't breaking down because a flood came through, and then you have to spend the next 5-10 years rebuilding your community. We want to make sure that these communities are adapting and resilient in the face of climate change. And then finally, we have environmental and energy justice. Here, I would invoke the Green New Deal. And when we talk about the Green New Deal, I think it's important to see it as first as a framework and a concept, and second as a policy, where people can quibble with different components of the Green New Deal in terms of policy planks. But I think that the concept behind the Green New Deal, which says that if we're going to transition our economy, we also need to make sure that there's a justice component and make sure that our communities and our people are taken care of. I think it's an important one that we should value at all levels of government, from the federal government to the state to, of course, cities. So to show some results from my work, this blue bar is individuals who couldn't pay their energy bill in the last year, all from May 2020 to May 2021. So for the first year of the pandemic, which is a depressing thing that we have to say now. The second orange bar is receiving a notice, and then the third, this kind of goldish bar, is being disconnected. And so we see some pretty stark disparities here, right? Maybe the most notable is if you look at the gold bar for low-income white households and the gold bar for low-income Hispanic households. It shows that we have a disparity of almost 4 times more Hispanic households being disconnected than white households. So these are the kind of disparities that we are seeing when it comes to energy insecurity. And the pandemic undoubtedly made these things worse, but they also clearly existed before the pandemic. We've shown disparities going back quite some time. So this is not a new phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon that is nonetheless being worsened has been worsened by the pandemic and will be worsened, I contend, by climate change. One thing that I heard a lot early on in the pandemic, if you read these news articles and these op-eds, one of the most common sentiments early on in the pandemic was that COVID was going to be the great equalizer because, it's a virus, it's a pandemic, anybody can get it. And so we're not going to have the same disparities between poor and rich. And of course, what we saw was the polar opposite, that it was the great, I guess you could say, inequality revealer, right? We saw the exact opposite of it being an equalizer, and climate change is no different. It's almost an identical sort of ideological model where clearly we're going to see disparities be revealed as opposed to the idea that climate change is going to be a great equalizer because it affects us all. It very clearly affects different populations differently. Here's something that I found interesting, and this data has been collected throughout the pandemic, and it's kind of very back and forth, but I do think it's an interesting also case study from the pandemic to climate change, where we saw early on when these stay-at-home orders were put in place that residential energy use was increasing, right? Which is something that I think that it's easy to ignore, but if people go to work every day for 8 hours, 5 days a week, what that means is for those 5 days a week, basically you're in some way the place that you're working is subsidizing your energy consumption, right? So you're not at home running heat, you're not at home running running your electronics, but you're actually in the workplace, and that's where your energy needs are being met. And so this is specifically about staying home and consuming more energy at home. But of course, when as climate change increases, if a typical week would have been, say, 94 degrees and now it's 97 degrees or 98 degrees, it's going to cost more to cool your home over that time period. So we're going to see similar effects where we see an increase in energy costs, and as I mentioned, that's going to increase disparities as these energy burdens hit low-income households much harder. So here I just want to show this is a little bit of a left turn, but I think it's interesting. This is a 2017 study that we did where we surveyed public opinion on energy infrastructure. And the important thing to note here is these numbers that are highlighted, which shows that renewable energy is extremely popular among the public. So when we look at solar, we see only 9% say that they're opposed in a survey, right? So one of the claims of the environmental justice movement since it started in the 1980s is to say that we need to democratize energy production, and people should have a seat at the table in deciding, which kind of facilities get sited in their communities, but also what does their production mix look like? What do we want to actually produce, and where should that production take place? And what is very clear from this survey and other public opinion polls is that the public is really demanding renewable energy. They're strongly supportive of it. So I think that we need to be very clear and unequivocal in saying that when we talk about energy transition, we're also talking about a response to the public will. This is not something that we've decided that we want to do, and we're just flouting the public and doing what we want. This is very much popular policy and a policy that people demand, as we see, in the case of solar, where we have 73% support and only 9% opposed. It's clear, sort of unequivocal support from the public to transition to renewable energy. So we have a recent case study of the very thing that I'm talking about. I want to highlight here when it comes to climate change and justice. I think at the time of this headline, there's been a lot more recorded deaths since, but at the time of this headline, there was only 13 deaths in New York City from the flooding. And what we saw was that 11 of the 13 were from these basement apartment units, which is kind of spectacular. And I think the 12th was somebody in their car. So what we saw here is that people, in a city that has become largely unaffordable for low-income people, homeowners will rent out their basements to low-income renters that don't have the safety standards that they should have. In many cases, safety standards that are actually illegal. But this is happening all over New York City, obviously widespread enough that as soon as a flood comes, we have people that don't live in places that have the protection against flooding. And that was where the concentration of deaths happened in New York City. So we have a very, very clear case study here of exactly what we're discussing when we talk about a just energy transition, that this is not an issue that's going to affect everybody equally. This is an issue that is going to hit low income populations much, much harder, both within the United States, but of course also globally, where we have, already have island nations who are having to move away from their homelands because those homelands are being affected by sea level rise, right? Clear disparities in who's actually being impacted. And if we don't pay attention to those, we run the risk of, as we engage in this transition that we all know that we need, that we actually make the burdens worse on low income households. And I think that we'd all agree that would be a pretty dire mistake when we talk about trying to transition to an economy that works for more people. So this is a big fancy chart. We don't need to look at every component of it, but it's a chart that my co-authors made in David Kaniski, Sonia Carley, and Michelle Graff made about vulnerability and how this works in the energy space. So this is kind of some of the ways that we think about energy and security, and we think about vulnerability in terms of populations that are most affected, right? The elderly are deeply affected by these energy insecurities, where they need to have their temperature. They can't really adjust in the same way that younger people might be able to. If it gets too cold or too hot, they're in serious danger. We talk about like prices and elasticity, and the fact that people can't adjust their spending if they're low income in the same way that higher income people can. We talk about programs that are available and often underfunded for actually helping people solve some of these problems. So again, these are just some of the ways that we think about the energy transition. We think about vulnerability during the process. And then my final slide, I'll present some potential solutions. A thing that we talk about a lot is the expansion of WAP and LIHEAP. WAP is the Weatherization Assistance Program, and LIHEAP is funding for low-income households to be able to help pay their energy bill. And what we've seen from both of these programs is, for households that get them, they are extremely effective, but they are programs that are radically underfunded, and not many people get them. And so we could help to solve a lot of these problems. And again, if we're talking about energy transition, these are the type of programs that we should rely on to ensure that people who, again, are facing these burdens are able to relieve themselves. One thing that we always stress very heavily is that weatherization really works. It shows huge dividends, and it's kind of this low-hanging fruit when it comes to public policy, because we actually can solve a lot of these energy and security problems, or not solve, but mitigate a lot of these energy and security problems just by weatherizing homes. But again, WAP is extremely underfunded. Secondly is revenue recycling carbon taxes, right? So there's been a lot of talk about the carbon tax and a lot of push for it to happen. But we should also note with the carbon tax that we shouldn't just be taxing and then, that's it. We should also be using that revenue in order to invest in programs that will help people mitigate the climate crisis. And so for my money, I would like a lot of the revenue recycling to be based around helping communities that are going to be the most harm. I think that's a good way to raise and then distribute funds. Of course, subsidizing solar installations. Again, this is an energy burden issue where, for the time being, it's still expensive for households to do solar installations, and so solar installations have been for a few years basically the domain of the wealthy or the upper middle class, because a low income person is very unlikely to make these huge investments that are going to potentially raise their energy costs, right? It just doesn't make sense for them to do so. But if we want them to install these solar programs, then we should be willing to subsidize them and fund them and make sure that they're affordable. Changing zoning laws has been widely discussed and has been shown in a lot of academic settings to be very, very effective. Changing in zoning laws can lower housing prices, can make neighborhoods more walkable, which obviously means less car emissions, and then ultimately reduce the carbon footprints of cities in terms of density. Studies have shown that land use changes could avoid, I think one study showed 200 million tons of carbon by the year 2030 could be avoided just through adjustments of land use. So land use is a big policy tool. We have renewable production tax credits for utilities to produce more clean energy. And then finally, the electrification of ride sharing. We obviously know that that ride sharing has become a huge industry in the United States, and we want to ensure that these are moved towards EV, and then that will also increase EV capacity so that we don't have these charging deserts where people aren't able to buy electric vehicles because they can't charge them. And with that, I will pass it on to Mo to talk about a particular solution in Indianapolis.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt that transition and ask if we could do some questions now. Is that okay, Trevor?
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Okay, we'll just have a brief time for questions now. Of course, if there aren't any, we can move on to Mo, but I didn't want folks to forget the things they were thinking about through your talk. So I'll open the floor to questions that anyone might have. Remember,
sorry, Sarah. We actually do questions after the presentations, after both of them.
Oh, okay.
But
So
yeah, that was completely my bad. But feel free to continue. Feel free to send your questions into the chat box during both the presentations, and then we'll get to them at the end.
okay. Sorry to throw us off. Take it away, Mo.
All right, thank you so much, Trevor. I'm so glad Trevor got to give his presentation first and then ours, because I think it's an excellent example of the data behind the project that we did, and then, come on, little guy, and then showing what it was that we were able to produce on behalf of the city of Indianapolis. So you all can see my screen.
I think you want to hit enable editing so that you can make it full screen.
Okay.
And Mo, we can't see your screen now, just so you know.
Okay. Here we go. How's that?
You might want to hit the presentation mode, and then I think we'll be good to see everything.
I got it. One more time.
Okay.
Third time's a charm. Here we go. Even when you practice, it still doesn't go perfectly.
It's still not showing up as presentation mode, but I think it's okay. We can still see your slides if you can just move through them.
Okay. So, yes, absolutely. I am here to talk to you about the community solar project that we conducted in Indianapolis, Indiana, part of we call it the low and moderate income solar pilot project. I am McReynolds. I'm the community engagement manager with the Office of Sustainability for the city of Indianapolis. All of this comes out of Thrive Indianapolis, which is the city's first sustainability and resilience plan. It was passed in 2019 and is as I said, the first sustainability and resilience plan. It was passed by City County Council of the city of Indianapolis in 2019. It's made up of 59 action items that aim to make Indianapolis a more sustainable and equitable place to live. We conducted extensive community engagement as a part of developing Thrive Indianapolis in order to hear the voices of the residents of the city of Indianapolis to contribute to what actually went into the plan. This was not stakeholder based. This was not based on what the city wanted to do. We wanted this to be a community reflective plan so that when we go to do the work, when we go to implementation, we can say, this is what the city of Indianapolis, the residents of the city wanted us to do. This plan will not be completed by the city alone. It takes the entire community, not just the Office of Sustainability, not just the city. In our office, we certainly refer to that as the Hoosier Way. We need private-public partnerships. We need private-private partnerships. We need nonprofit, we need every single kind of partnership in order to accomplish all the 59 actions in this Thrive Indianapolis. If you'd like to go into this at any point, and I'll refer to this later, the entire plan is listed on thriveindianapolis.com. The plan is made up of 8 elements: built environment, economy, energy, transportation and land use, natural resources, food and urban agriculture, public health and safety, waste and recycling. Today, we're going to talk about a section in where this particular project came from, which is in the energy section. We had 2 overarching goals from Thrive Indianapolis. One is, I hope you can see the first part is increasing community resilience by prioritizing equity in policy planning and project implementation. This is really where the idea of low to moderate income comes from. We see the equity portion employed there.
So Mo, I'm just going to interrupt you and just let you know that we aren't seeing your slides advancing.
Oh, okay.
So if we can't, there you go. Now we can see. Yes,
we got it.
Click on them.
So there were the sections. Here's our overarching goals. And I'm here on 1, already got that. 2 is the mayor's 2017 public commitment to carbon neutrality for the city of Indianapolis by 2050. And that's where the solar project comes from. We're trying to join these two, and the low and moderate income solar program is a perfect microcosm of these two overarching goals joined in one project. Advancing my own notes here. All right, so we need data in order to make decisions. We don't go into things blind of our data. We know that Indianapolis is going to be affected by climate change, as we see reflected in Trevor's work. You know, these are some of the primary talking points that Indianapolis and how Indianapolis will be affected by oncoming climate change, especially when we were deriving the plan in 2019 and 19. With this information, this was certainly some of the data that helped form the ideas around energy independence and wanting to offer the participation in the solar market to residents of Indianapolis, you know, and with the guys that they were low to moderate income qualified. We will certainly, we also see from the UN's IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If you haven't read that report, please get into that. That's an excellent second example of why and how our nation and our world will be affected by climate change. All right, so this is the energy section. The vision there, each section has sort of primary goals, but the specific action item we're talking about today is deploying strategies that allow our community to overcome existing hurdles in solar energy installations, including education on and assistance with solar cooperatives and bulk purchasing contracts. For that portion, we really look to our community partners to implement a lot of that. We try to promote as much education as possible. Solar United Neighbors, who I'll talk about here coming up, and Kepler Institute are wonderful, wonderful partners that do a lot of this on a daily basis. Just their existence in Indianapolis alone means that we accomplish a whole lot of that. Again, that is our community partners helping us accomplish the goals from Thrive Indianapolis. And then the second portion here, excuse me, pilot 1 community solar program by 2025. And that is what we did. And we accomplished this goal. We consider this one accomplished, and we certainly did it before 2025, which is pretty exciting to us. So what does a project look like? What does it look like to conduct a solar or a low to moderate income solar project? We started looking at this in fall 2019. We certainly had to work with community partners. This was going to be a pilot. Again, our partners are essential, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But the general outline around this project became Indianapolis residents applying for solar panel installation and in some scenarios, weatherization and reinforcement of their residence. So a basic application program where we whittled down those who qualified, those who didn't qualify, assessed their houses. I'll get into that in a little bit, but we want to call out specifically where the funding came from. Thank you to the Energy Foundation for funding the community outreach portion, where we were able to talk to as many qualified residents as possible about this program and their potential implementation of it. And then the Office of Sustainability was able to fundraise for and committed to the installations, or at least a portion of them. So the real stars here, again, are our community partners. Impossible to do this work without our community partners. We are so grateful for them. Kepler Institute, who conducted all of our community engagement and outreach. Solar United Neighbors, who makes it possible to be in this space whatsoever. Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership, who conducted our low to moderate income qualifications of our participants. Bloomberg Philanthropy's American Cities Climate Challenge, that was able to add some technical support through our participation. Again, Energy Foundation, who helped fund the initial portion. And then all of these other organizations that played a part. Again, impossible to do this work without them. So project implementation, really important to outline some of this. So we put forth the application. So Sun and Kepler Institute were able to get that out there. We had dozens of people from the city or residents apply. We whittled through all of those. We conducted income verification with the Indianapolis Neighborhood Housing Partnership. We inspected the structures, made sure that the houses, the roofs, whatever structure it was on, were viable and feasible to hold the solar panels themselves, and conducted evaluation of those locations. Conducted system design, exactly what load would need to be capable for that particular house to ease their energy burden, and then selected recipients, and we were off and running. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but again, so important to have our community partners involved here to help, with some of the equity portions of this, to be able to make sure we were not selecting residents, but allowing them to move through the process and allowing the process to select the residents. So the city of Indianapolis, come on, little slide. The city of Indianapolis, our office was active in funding a certain number of installations, and then we looked toward crowdfunding. We had a certain number that we were able to fund, and then we wanted to see how many more we could do. So we put out a crowdfunding site with Solar United Neighbors, and we were able to raise about $20,000 to cover additional installations as part of this pilot. So thank you for all of those who donated. And this is just one more example of how this is an important subject in our community. This is an important subject nationwide, and people care about energy burden. They care about lessening that for those who would otherwise not be able to enter into this market, as Trevor cited before. We got to do the fun part here. We got to celebrate the installations themselves. There are our representatives from Solar United Neighbors, the mayor, from our office, from the resident themselves, from the installers. This was a cool and sunny November day where we were setting up to install in this particular resident's house. This is the fun part. This is where you get to see the action happen. So we were very glad to celebrate that first installation. This is the impact of our project. There was about $122,000 in total investment. I'm not going to read through all of these things, but the biggest part of this is that we are easing the energy burden, and in most cases completely offsetting the energy burden that they previously had. So not only lowering their carbon footprint, but making it so that they no longer have energy bills. Or utility bills, excuse me. The over the lifetime of the panels on the particular houses, it's carbon offset of over 25 years. So that's just an incredible impact for most of these houses. It just really shows that a lot can, or a little can do a lot. And that's what all of this boils down to. We did have some acknowledgement in local press, which we're always excited about. WFYI here covering it for us as citing it as an energy equity initiative, which we're glad to know. And then as a follow-up, as a next step, if you are interested in getting involved in something like this or learning more about Sun, learning more about Indiana Solar, There's an opportunity coming up September 20th, Monday, September 20th, presented by our partners, Solar United Neighbors, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. And some of the information we're going to send out after this, I'd be glad to send a link to that. And then if you would like to follow our office, if there's ever opportunities to follow our work or stay engaged with what we're doing, please do visit thriveindianapolis.com, the City of Indianapolis's website, indy.gov, or follow us on any of these channels on our social media. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mo. And now it's actually time for questions. So you can put those questions into the chat, or we are really happy to have live questions. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question now, we'd be happy to have them. I'll just pause for a minute.
Hi, my name is Evelyn Bauman. I'm with the City of South Bend in Indiana, and thank you both, Trevor and Mo, for your presentations today. Mo, I had one specific question because Sun is actually working up here in Northern Indiana. They've launched a co-op in the area, and I've been having a number of discussions with them about the Indy program that you just shared more information on, and I'm curious around the application piece specifically. And we talked, Trevor mentioned the time tax for folks who are in that low and moderate income demographic too, and thinking of the additional burden, right, of paperwork and how to balance that in the city if we are to try and do a similar program just to honestly take advantage of the structure of the co-op existing right now and the fact that net metering expires next summer. It seems like this would be a missed opportunity if we didn't move forward with something like that, but I'm struggling with ways to not make it a burden on those households, to also find households for conversations around weatherization and home repair that are in good enough condition to benefit from solar. So I'm wondering around what was required from the application and kind of the time intensity on both ends for the applicant and then for you and Sun.
Yeah, so we funded, that's part of what the Energy Foundation funded, was that outreach and the program development portion. I can send you especially if you send me your email here in a DM or a public message, either way, I can send you our recipient agreement. We did have a short recipient agreement, but it was really a pretty basic application. The time we considered all of that, the time intensity application itself was not very great because you really just had to be interested. We put out the this basic application. Kipper Institute which is a wonderful local organization, was able to conduct a number of outreach meetings for us, especially going to places where people were already meeting, and so to not create additional opportunities. And then it was listed online, so they did a lot of the outreach for us, again, which we compensated them to do. Again, I think I oversimplified it a little bit in saying that the application wasn't very complicated, but then the process itself was the part of it. When we went out to their homes, was their house suitable for it? We were able to verify their income through INHP. So that process sort of took care of itself. They didn't need to present a whole lot because we were able to do that with INHP, who specializes in that. If you'd like to have a separate conversation, we can get into some of those details, but we tried to think of that as much as possible in order to ease some of that time burden.
Thanks, sounds good. I'll send my email.
Great, I'm glad you can connect, Evelyn. So I have a question that got directed to me, and I wonder if it's a good one, I think, for Trevor to respond to. What is the role of the utility in a just energy transition?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and it's one that people in my field struggle with a lot. I think one of the very first things that I would call for is more transparency. One of the biggest issues that we have as researchers is that there's just not that much information available, and utilities tend to be very secretive with what they report. And so there's just a lot of things that we don't know about utility behavior. So for example, we study disconnections a lot, and we really don't know who is disconnecting people. We don't even have access to that information, which seems like it should be, kind of the most basic reporting requirement. And I think that would tell us just that knowing that fact alone would tell us a lot about the kind of structural problems with utilities, but we just don't have access. So it's tough to say a lot about utilities because we just don't know that much. And the reason that we don't know that much, I think, is it starts with transparency. So that would be the place where I would start, is that if we can sort of open up what we know and what we can know, I think that we have a whole lot of researchers who are ready to go and waiting to do a lot to learn a lot more, but we just don't know that much right now because we just don't have that much information, unfortunately.
Mo, do you have anything to add to that?
It's a difficult position to ask, particularly because we do have carbon neutrality goals, which means needing to work with our utilities to ask them, demand different things from our utilities in terms of the city being a customer. I think that some of it can be not necessarily a responsibility, but a role that the customer of a utility organization can have to demand they use renewables as part of their mix. I know the city itself, our office responds to the IRP, which is a way that the utility conducts, essentially their policy of what they're going to generate in terms of their utility usage. It's complicated, and it continues to roll out in terms of what the utilities will and won't do.
Also, just add really quickly, I mentioned in the solutions section that there's these renewable production tax credits have become relatively popular on the side of advocates, but what we've seen is very, very low take-up rates, just because there's not the incentives in place for utilities to take advantage of them. So the responsibility goes both ways. Obviously, we need to ask more from utilities, but we also need to put them in a position where they're they have the incentive to do these things as well.
Yeah, and one way that residents or that customers can get involved with their utilities of demanding those things that the utilities have the opportunities to respond is getting involved in some of those green credit programs or any of those opportunities to vote with their dollars.
That's a great segue to another direct question that came to me. Are there programs in Indy to help households reduce their energy need that could be coupled with solar installations? Could any of those programs be replicated in other communities?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Mostly they're through the utilities themselves. There are weatherization programs or energy assistance programs, specifically through AES Indiana. CEGs has its own set of weather or assistance programs. The city doesn't have any directly. There are a number of nonprofits that do get involved in some utility burden easing. I don't know that there's a great cumulative list of those, but I think the best way to start is utilizing what the utility already offers.
Great. Trevor, do you have anything to add to that? I don't know if in your research you've looked at such programs. No, okay. Great. Well, we have a couple of questions that have come through the chat. I'll just read the first one. Erica asks, Mo, did you focus on helping households electrify HVAC and appliances to eliminate natural gas, propane use for heating, cooking, water heaters, clothes dryers?
We did not. It was just not a part of this particular scope.
Mm-hmm. And then Lillian has just asked, in Michigan, as a part of PA 295, I don't remember the more recent act, we have required energy efficiency programs where the utility collects a surcharge from each customer, which is pooled and redistributed for energy efficiency projects. We also have MisSaves, where utilities are allowed to loan money at low or no interest, and it's paid back through your utility bill. Are there such programs in Indiana?
And not that I'm aware of with AES Indiana, and then there's different providers all over the state. For Marion County, our only utility in terms of electricity provider is AES Indiana.
Yeah, I think that's a really good comment to sort of just thinking about some of the solutions to the issues that we're talking about today. And also, obviously, of course, ensuring that when we talk about, collecting fees from customers to repatriate, in terms of these programs, we want to make those as progressive as possible so that higher income households who can afford these things are the ones that are, again, facing higher burdens than low income households who really don't have the margin to spare.
This is Caroline Nellis from Evansville. Since the net metering is being phased out here in Indiana, that seems like it knocks out the incentives for, for people going solar, including the poor. How do you overcome that?
I think it just depends, Caroline, on your particular economic position. There are certainly some people that net metering is much more of a, to use Trevor's phrase, on the margin, if net metering is a big part of that for you. I hope that doesn't knock out the entire market. I still hope that there's possibility for us to reinstate net metering within some portion of our time, given, some real cooperation and bipartisan efforts at the State House. We know that our partner, Solar United Neighbors, is working on that advocacy piece all the time.
Trevor, any comments on that? Here's another question that came to me. Indiana has a lot of coal production in the southern part of the state. What could economic redevelopment look like in that part of the state to help those communities justly transition to a new energy economy?
Yeah, that is kind of the big question, I think, when it comes to transition. And I think I don't have a lot of like detailed solutions, but I would say that one thing that's important is to make sure that we're sensitive to variations in community types and areas when we talk about these things, where it's not going to be, the kind of caricature has been that we just teach, coal miners to code, right? And obviously that's been kind of a punchline, but we need to make sure that we're sensitive to the differences in economies, in the type of the workforce, right? So in some areas we have people who are young going into those jobs, and you might have the average age of the coal industry, might be 29 years old. And so you're talking about kind of a whole different ball game than if you have an industry that's been there for a long time, and maybe, your average worker is 48 and they've worked in the industry for a long time, and, retraining is going to be much more difficult. So I would just say, there are obviously a ton of options for economic redevelopment, but the sort of key feature should be that we're sensitive to, the actual makeup of the industry, the actual makeup of the economy, to ensure that the options that we're providing are actually feasible, right? So we're not having, 55-year-olds try to go back and get a 4-year degree or something. That's just not going to be feasible in many areas.
Yeah, that all resonates with me. I'm from Eastern Kentucky, another coal heavy place, and where the economy is based on that so much. So I understand that frustration for folks also in Southern Indiana and the challenge of that. I guess, Trevor, I'm curious if you could go back and talk a little bit more about land use and the carbon that we could potentially save because with adjusting zoning and thinking about mixed income communities. If someone in the chat asked you for the citation of that, and I'm just curious if you could dig a little bit deeper into why that's the case.
Yeah, so I'm very, very far from an expert on this, so I can't like give a sort of academic detailed discussion of it. But essentially, this is related to issues of density, and one way to think about this is just like the verticality of cities, where some cities are built very poorly, where they're horizontal, and we're not sort of stacking buildings on top of each other to have more density, which is some people are frustrated with this, but nonetheless, in many cities, that's going to be a sort of necessary change if we're going to fight climate change. And I think the big one, the one that's underrated, is just how unwalkable most of our cities are, and how that has a huge impact. I mean, we have thousands and thousands of hours spent in cars that really don't need to be, but are anyways. And of course, again, it's the mixed income housing. The purpose is to have affordable housing that people can actually live there, as opposed to just sort of pricing out whole communities. And so making our cities more walkable is one of these things that might sound trite, but when you actually sort of measure the numbers of how many people are driving unnecessarily when they don't have to be, it really could have quite a big impact. So I think that's about as much as I could say. There's a lot of resources out there, but I'm definitely not an expert on land use. But I do know that it's that a lot of academic work has shown that there are huge impacts from the way that we that we conduct land use policy.
So not just mixed income, but also mixed use would
Yes,
be a part of
yes.
it, right? Okay,
Yeah.
great. That's a good clarification. Mo,
Can I also add that there's a
Oh, sure.
whole lot being done, especially in the R&D spaces of what solar can look like. There are buildings that they're been piloted to have solar as part of the windows that you would just look through it. There's all different kinds. And I think over the next 10 to 15 years, especially in states and communities where net metering or different policy aspects are employed in terms of the economic value of solar, you'll only continue to see that rise so that you're not needing the traditional flat brownfield or grass underneath, or regardless of what the state house has passed in the last session, local Wildflower incorporated with your solar, those traditional type of fields. Hopefully there are ways that we can to steal something from Trevor, to challenge the verticality of solar in Indiana.
Great. Mo, if a local government wanted to implement a similar program to yours in their city, what do you think would be a good first step?
Find the partners. I'm sure I sounded like a broken record, but you need those partners. You need someone who can reach out into your community, conduct the proper outreach, probably on your behalf. The city is not always the best partner or the best mouthpiece for trying to do community projects. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Finding a nonprofit, especially a housing-based nonprofit that already does, like, not recreating the wheel, but is already doing low to moderate income verification, is a great one. And if you can get Solar United Neighbors or someone like them in your community, find them, because that is those three pieces. Before you even find funding, find the partners who can do the job with you and for you.
Great. I want to maybe offer up one more question. If anyone has one, speak up now. Okay, if not, then I'm going to turn it over to Beverly to close us out then. I see we have some attrition. It's about on the hour, so.
Thanks everyone for the opportunity.
I just released the feedback survey, so please fill it out so that we can see how we can improve the webinar series, and just to hear your general thoughts about it. I want to thank Mo and Trevor for presenting at our first webinar series, our first webinar of the 2021 to 2022 Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series. We really appreciated it. Your presentations definitely showed the importance of incorporating a just energy transition into our community's resilience. And as you illustrated, community solar projects are a great method that communities can take to improve energy equity. I would also like to thank all of our attendees for joining the webinar today and contributing to the discussion. I definitely learned a lot of stuff, and it was just really interesting to hear about it all. As mentioned before, I will send a follow-up email next week with a recording of the webinar, all the resources listed, as well as contact information in case you want to reach out and ask any questions that we could not get to today. I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which will be on October 13th, the second Wednesday. And yeah, thank you all so much. Have a lovely rest of your day.